This is Wild Green Streams. I'm Rhett. As we speak, the Wild Green universe is embroiled in our annual charity battle. That is our annual conservation fundraiser for our group's nonprofit, Wild Green Future, in which Wild Green Memes group members divide into nature-themed gangs based on their favorite ecological interests and compete to see which gang can raise the most money for conservation and win the charity battle. Today on the show we have Dr. Jaret Daniels, curator and director of the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity. We're about to enter Tier 2 of this year's charity battle, which will fund a grant for work Dr. Daniels' lab is doing to conserve the frosted elfin, a declining North American butterfly species. Jaret, welcome to the pod.
Nice to be here.
Could you tell people a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a curator here at the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, Florida. And my lab's an insect conservation lab. So we focus on really at-risk species, those that are declining to those that are critically imperiled and listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And our goal is really to develop strategies and conduct research to enhance how conservation work is done and kind of build the model better to ensure that these organisms, which are in desperate need of conservation, actually have a future on this planet.
When I look through the projects that you and your lab are doing, it's extensive. And the projects that y'all have done in the past, it's a lot of different stuff. Do you want to pick out like one or two just to tell people about?
Yeah, sure. So one of the longest standing projects we have is with a federally endangered butterfly called Schaus's swallowtail. So this is one of the first two insects added to the U.S. endangered species list, and it's our only federally endangered swallowtail butterfly in the U.S. And this is a butterfly that's endemic to Southeast Florida. And back in 2012, there were only about 4 individuals of this butterfly found in the wild, so critically close to extinction. And since kind of trying to breed this butterfly in captivity, release individuals back into the environment, work with our partners on habitat restoration and some natural recovery. Today, those numbers are back to kind of pre-Hurricane Andrew levels. So, approaching, 1,000 individuals in the wild. So we're really trying to ensure that this butterfly population continues to grow. We're also reintroducing it to new locations within the historic range in the Florida Keys to kind of ensure that not all the eggs are in one basket, so to speak, in case a major hurricane hits one location, that there are multiple island populations to provide resilience and ultimately ensure that, it has a rich and, solid future in the state of Florida upcoming in years to come. So that's a long-standing project, and that kind of embodies a lot of what we do. We work on the ground with partners like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service. We do a lot of work in the lab on research, but we also do captive breeding. We breed butterflies in the lab, understand how to do that work really well, and then reintroduce butterflies back into the environment to establish new self-sustaining populations or augment other populations. And one of the other little butterflies we've been working a long time on is the Miami blue butterfly. And this is a similar, kind of has a similar story to Schaus's swallowtail. It's had severe decline and now is only really extant in a few islands to the west of Key West. And it has less of a bright future than Schaus's swallowtail, but we still are optimistic that we can be successful with this butterfly as well in the future.
What was the story with Schaus's? What led it to that point?
Well, it's always been really limited in range in Florida, and it got dealt a pretty severe blow when Hurricane Andrew hit directly into the habitat, and then over time, it's just it's very susceptible to climatic changes, weather change over time, because it has a single spring flight period that kind of coincides with the onset of the rainy season for flush of new growth of its 2 larval host plants. And so, over the last 2 decades, the reliability of those spring rains have been pretty episodic because of climate change. And so that has triggered some challenges with the butterfly. Also, as some of the hammock areas in which it occupies have grown up, it has kind of shaded out some of the understory nectar and other resources. So it is a disturbance reliant species. So some level of wind disturbance like tropical storms or hurricane impact is important. Too much is a bad thing, but not enough is also a bad thing. So we've learned over the years to work with, a bunch of our partners to augment the habitat, plant more host plants, do a little bit of natural sort of tree fall gap, opening the canopy, some natural wind disturbance, and then a lot of work kind of rebuilding the populations in South Florida. And all that has collectively kind of changed the trajectory of this butterfly's population over time to, really in free fall to kind of going back the other way. And today it's a real success story of recovery thanks to a lot of partners and a lot of hard work.
That's amazing to hear. I think we should talk about the results from last year's grants. So last year, the Wild Green Charity Battle actually funded 2 grants with Jaret's lab, one of which was for another declining butterfly species that we'll talk about in a moment. But the first was an outreach grant, which related to getting native plants into people's yards.
This has been a really exciting initiative for us. It's an initiative called Plant for Pollinators. And thanks to funding from Wild Green Future, we were able to host a number of events around the Gainesville community last year to give away over 1,000 native plants for people to, take home and really start, oftentimes for the first time, a wildlife landscape, a pollinator-friendly landscape. We view this as an opportunity to get people excited about the importance of what you can do in your own home landscape. Get them excited, get them the opportunity to be exposed to this rich diversity of insect pollinators and native plants. And hopefully that's a cascade that will keep them coming back and back to, making that a rich, diverse landscape for wildlife and pollinators. And it was an incredibly successful year. Like I said, we gave away over 1,000 plants. We had just a tremendous amount of outpouring of community goodwill for that effort. And it's just a highly rewarding thing to see the excitement of people when they get that free plant and the follow through. We also had an opportunity where through that initiative, if they took a picture of the plant planted in their landscape, we gave them a $10 gift certificate to an exhibit at the Florida Museum of Natural History or to some other, takeaway item as kind of a carrot at the end of the stick. And we just got so many emails with pictures, really a pride of that plant in their landscape. And it just was, it showed that a little bit of goodwill just really seeded the long-standing opportunity to get people excited about the natural world around them.
What I love about this project is that, I hear a lot from talking to people who are interested in wildlife, but not necessarily natural resource professionals, that they care about nature and they want something that they can do, but they don't feel as though there are a lot of options available to them beyond just donating to a nonprofit, which is great, by the way. Y'all should go do that right now at wildgreencharitybattle.org. But in addition to that, I love that this has given people something that they can do that makes a material impact for pollinators and for native plants and for the landscape in general. We had Doug Tallamy on the podcast a few months ago of Homegrown National Park, and his whole thing that he talks about is how there are 40 million acres just in the United States in lawn right now. If even a fraction of that were made into wildlife habitat or used native plants for landscaping, it would be as though we had created an entirely new national park bigger than Yellowstone and Yosemite combined. Planting native plants in your yard is really a way that you can join a movement and create a change very directly and very immediately that really couldn't be done by anyone else. No one else can plant a plant in your yard or put something on your balcony.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's, as you mentioned, like getting people to realize that the choices they make in their own landscape really do matter. If they diversify their land, they have resources for birds and butterflies and bees and other wildlife, and then they get their neighbor excited, and that kind of expands throughout their neighborhood and through their community, then you're getting kind of corridors for wildlife. You're getting rich resources. So it really does start at home, and a little bit goes a long way. It doesn't mean you have to re-landscape your property. Even a container garden can be quite useful. And it also just keeps people outside looking, in their landscape. And that by itself is, good for their mental well-being, good for their health, just gets them excited about the rich diversity of our natural world around them. And it's, there's absolutely no downside to any of that.
So what's the story with the frosted elfin?
So the frosted elfin is a small little brown butterfly. It has a pretty wide range historically within the U.S., from Texas to Florida and north to the New England states and Wisconsin, Minnesota. But historically, or at least over the last couple of decades, it's declined pretty precipitously to the point where now it's really lost ground in several states. It's been extirpated from Ontario. It's been extirpated from several other U.S. states. And really the bulk of the really healthy populations remain in only a few states like Florida, New York, and states west of the Mississippi like Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. So it kind of has gone the way of many other species. It was wide ranging, but now it's really declining significantly, a lot due to habitat loss, a lot due to habitat management. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked us to get involved with this butterfly in a number of different ways. They gave us some initial funding to start a captive breeding population using Florida stock here at our lab in Gainesville, also to conduct the first ever range-wide population genetic structure analysis to understand the genetic health of this butterfly across the entire range. And this butterfly is a candidate for federal listing upcoming. So it's very likely that this butterfly will be added to the U.S. endangered species list in a few years. So it deserves a lot of conservation attention, and it occurs in this kind of unique system that's highly fire dependent. Down here in Florida, it's a sandhill species. Up in the Northeast or Midwest, it's like a pine or oak barren species. And all these systems require regular disturbance to open the canopy and to support its two larval host plants, which are wild indigo and wild lupin. So we have a lot of work to do with this butterfly, but we've been working with states like Virginia to develop an assurance population as well. And that's one of the objectives of this year's project, is to expand on that assurance population to ultimately develop a whole new captive breeding program for Virginia and eventually North Carolina, collect additional genetic resources so we understand at a local level how to manage this butterfly more effectively, how to understand where to select founder stock, how to select properties to reintroduce butterflies, to really to try to enhance our understanding of how to restore this species at a broader kind of regional scope.
So what is an assurance population?
So an assurance population is essentially just a captive population that could be a short-term population. It could be a breeding population that just ensures that in case wild populations are lost, that the species, the local genetic stock, the uniqueness of those local populations aren't lost with that wild population going extinct. So we're essentially capturing a portion of that wild stock, bringing it into a captivity to ensure it's safe, and then use that stock eventually to reintroduce it back into the wild to kind of build those populations more robustly.
Everyone knows the value of keeping a species, but what's the value of keeping the range consistent for a species? So like what's the problem with a big species with a wide range suddenly having a smaller range?
Well, that again, you're shrinking, kind of putting more of your eggs in one basket so that those populations become increasingly fragmented and smaller. Any disturbance then threatens the future of those populations. And because this is a species that does occur across several different areas like southern coastal plain, Piedmont, and mountains, some of those populations are pretty unique and distinct, and we want to capture sort of the evolutionary potential of those populations so that they have as much resilience under future land use change, future climate change scenarios, so that this butterfly actually has a future 20, 30, 50 years from now. And I think it's important to be as proactive as we can instead of waiting to a point where, we're down to only a few remaining populations. And, what do we do at this point? It's much harder to build back at that critical point than trying to be proactive and think about how do we capture as much diversity? How do we capture as much of those populations as possible and plan for restoring this butterfly across a wider range so it has just a more stable future ahead of it.
So, and to that end, we're also fundraising this year to help conduct trainings with Department of Natural Resources staff across a couple states. What's that project?
So that kind of dovetails with this whole effort, but because this butterfly is poorly known, especially across many southeastern states, a lot of departments of natural resource staff or other wildlife staff have limited experience surveying for this butterfly or understanding how to identify, good habitat. And so we want to help on the ground by providing some training resources to go out to some of these locations, get people out in the field to see the butterfly, to see ways of surveying for it. For example, this butterfly, even in good populations, can be fairly cryptic to find. And one of the best ways of really assessing a population is not necessarily looking at the adult butterflies, but surveying for the larvae, the caterpillars. And these are small. They're only a centimeter or so in length. And so giving people the training to understand what does a frosted elfin larva look like? What does feeding damage look like? How to maybe do nocturnal surveys with black lights, because these larvae actually fluoresce under black light at night, is a great way of just giving them more skills to understand how to assess what they have in their home state. So that's one of the goals we want to do on the ground this year, is work with these, wildlife staff and give them additional training so that they can, have these skills moving forward to try to find new populations, assess the populations that are out there, and ultimately collect valuable data so we know the trajectory of these populations long term.
Is there anything else in particular that you wanted to share about any of these projects?
Well, I think, in many ways, the frosted elfin is a good model because there's a lot of people interested. We can also, bring citizen science into this, but it kind of embodies where a lot of species are, that they were once fairly common and widespread, and they're declining. And I think, if you talk to anybody that's out in the wild right now, that most people would say, well, there are less species than there used to be when I was a child. There's less butterflies around than when I was a kid. And I think it's emblematic of where we are. And so we need to start being as proactive as we can before these species reach just such a critical level of decline where it's so much harder to build back those populations. And that's what we're trying to do with the frosted elfin, is to hit while we still have a lot of opportunity to build these populations back.
To join in on the charity battle, go to wildgreencharitybattle.org. To learn more about Wild Green Future and this year's fundraising goals, go to wildgreenfuture.org. Dr. Jaret Daniels, thanks for your time today, and thanks for the awesome work that you're doing.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Rhett.
Until next time, I'm Rhett.
And I'm Jaret.
And happy Year of the Frog.